November 3, 1942. The waters off Guadalcanal shimmer black under a moonless sky as Rear Admiral Daniel Callaghan's task force steams northwest towards Savo Island. On the bridge of the destroyer USS O'Bannon, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Wilkinson checks his watch. 0100 hours. Radar operators report Japanese surface contacts bearing 320 degrees. Range 27,000 yards. The contacts resolve into a formidable force. 2 battleships, a cruiser, and 14 destroyers, a Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe's bombardment group, tasked with pulverizing Henderson Field and its vital airstrip. In the plotting room below decks, fire control technicians prepare firing solutions, while loaders in the forward gun mounts stand ready beside racks of 5-inch shells. Each mount holds a weapon system that Japanese naval officers, studying captured technical manuals in the months following this battle, would describe as fundamentally altering their understanding of destroyer combat capability. The battle that erupted in the early morning darkness of November 13th would be remembered as one of the most chaotic naval engagements of the Pacific War. Ships from both sides intermixed at ranges so close that longer-range weapons became liabilities. Searchlights swept the darkness. Torpedoes crossed wakes in the confined waters. But amid the confusion, American destroyer captains discovered their 5-inch 38 caliber guns could maintain rates of fire that Japanese commanders had calculated to be physically impossible. The O'Bannon's forward mounts fired continuously for 12 minutes, expending over 450 rounds. Gun crews worked with mechanical precision, loading, firing, and clearing spent casings in a rhythm that reduced each firing cycle to under 7 seconds. Japanese destroyers, engaging at similar ranges, fired at intervals 3 times longer, their crews struggling with manual loading systems that had been designed for different tactical requirements. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The disparity in destroyer gun performance that became evident during the naval battle of Guadalcanal reflected design philosophies that had diverged years before the first shots of the Pacific War. American and Japanese naval architects had studied the same technological developments during the interwar period. Both nations understood that destroyer armament was evolving toward the dual-purpose weapons, capable of engaging surface targets and aircraft with equal effectiveness. Both recognized that rates of fire would be critical in the close-range engagements that modern naval warfare demanded. But the solutions each navy implemented revealed fundamentally different approaches to the relationship between crew skill and mechanical automation. The United States Navy adopted the 5-inch 38 caliber Mark 12 gun as its standard destroyer weapon. Beginning in the mid-1930s, the weapon was designed from the outset as a dual-purpose mount capable of engaging surface vessels, aircraft, and shore targets. The Mark 12 achieved this versatility through sophisticated mechanical systems that automated functions which other navies expected gun crews to perform manually. The gun incorporated a semi-automatic vertical sliding breech block that opened automatically after each shot as the gun recoiled. The spent casing was ejected via mechanical extractors. The breech remained open for loading, then closed automatically when a new round was inserted. This automation reduced the physical actions required from gun crews and allowed trained crews to maintain firing rates of 15 to 20 rounds per minute per gun. Under ideal conditions, with experienced crews, some destroyers achieved sustained rates approaching 22 rounds per minute. The Japanese Navy's primary destroyer weapon, the Type 3 127mm gun, used a different design approach. The Type 3 incorporated a horizontal sliding breech block that required manual operation for each firing cycle. After firing, the gun captain ordered the breech opened. A crew member manually operated the breech mechanism, sliding the block horizontally to expose the chamber. Another crew member used a long rammer to push the spent casing out the back of the breech. The empty casing fell to the deck where it had to be cleared away to prevent crew members from tripping during the next loading cycle. A fresh shell was then manhandled into the chamber, the breech was manually closed, and the gun was ready to fire again. This sequence required coordination among multiple crew members and consumed time that the American automatic breech eliminated. Japanese naval architects understood the limitations of manual breech operation. The Type 3 gun had been designed in the 1920s when most destroyer engagements were expected to occur at ranges where deliberate, aimed fire was more important than high rates of fire. The weapon was accurate and reliable, qualities that Japanese designers valued highly. But by the late 1930s, as aircraft became faster and more maneuverable, and as surface engagements began occurring at closer ranges where rapid fire was essential, the limitations of the Type 3 became apparent. Japanese naval planners initiated development of improved destroyer guns with higher rates of fire, but production priorities and resource constraints meant these weapons did not enter service in significant numbers until late in the war. The mechanical differences between American and Japanese destroyer guns extended beyond breech operation to ammunition handling systems that multiplied the effect of automation. American 5-inch mounts used shell hoists that brought ammunition from magazines below decks directly to the gun mount. The hoists were powered by electric motors and could deliver shells to the gun at rates matching or exceeding the gun's firing rate. Loaders simply had to take shells from the hoist and insert them into the breech. The ammunition was fixed, meaning the propellant charge was already attached to the projectile in a brass casing, similar to a rifle cartridge, but scaled up to 5 inches in diameter and weighing 54 pounds. Fixed ammunition simplified loading since crew members handled a single object rather than separate projectile and powder charge. Japanese Type 3 mounts used separate loading ammunition where the projectile and powder charge were distinct components. The projectile weighed 23 kilograms. The powder charge came in a brass case, weighing an additional 12 kilograms. During loading, one crew member had to insert the projectile into the chamber, while another crew member inserted the powder case behind it. This two-stage loading process consumed additional time and required more coordination than the American system, where a single loader could handle the complete round. Japanese destroyers did install mechanical hoists to move ammunition from magazines to gun mounts, but the hoists delivered projectiles and powder charges separately, requiring the gun crew to manage two distinct ammunition flows rather than one. The training systems that prepared American and Japanese destroyer crews for combat reflected these technological differences and amplified their effects. The United States Navy invested heavily in gunnery training throughout the interwar period, establishing specialized schools and creating standardized curricula that emphasized mechanical proficiency and speed. Destroyer gun crews underwent months of training that included dry firing exercises where crews practiced loading sequences without live ammunition until the movements became automatic. Live fire exercises then validated that training, with crews expected to meet specific benchmarks for rate of fire and accuracy. American destroyer doctrine emphasized volume of fire as a primary factor in combat effectiveness. Fire control manuals instructed gun crews that in most engagement scenarios, the ship that could bring more shells on target in the first few minutes would win the encounter. This doctrine shaped training priorities. Crews practiced rapid fire until they could maintain maximum rates for extended periods without degradation in accuracy or mechanical reliability. The 5-inch 38's design supported this doctrine by making sustained rapid fire mechanically feasible. The weapon's automatic breech operation, fixed ammunition, and powered hoists all reduced the physical demands on gun crews, allowing them to maintain high rates of fire longer than would be possible with manual systems. Japanese destroyer gunnery training emphasized accuracy and efficiency rather than maximum rate of fire. Japanese naval doctrine expected destroyers to engage at longer ranges where aimed fire would be decisive. Training focused on deliberate fire control procedures where each shot was carefully aimed and timed. Gun crews learned to work smoothly with the manual loading systems, minimizing wasted motion and coordinating their actions to achieve respectable rates of fire. But Japanese doctrine did not emphasize sustained rapid fire the way American training did. The assumption was that engagements would be decided by well-aimed torpedoes and gunfire rather than by overwhelming volumes of shells. These doctrinal differences reflected broader assumptions about how destroyer actions would unfold. Japanese surface warfare doctrine placed heavy emphasis on night actions where destroyers would use superior optics and training to achieve surprise. Japanese destroyers carried powerful torpedo armaments. The Type 93 long lance torpedo was superior to American torpedoes in range, speed, and warhead size. Japanese tactical planning expected destroyers to close to torpedo range, launch their weapons, and then withdraw or engage with guns as needed. The gun was important but secondary to the torpedo as the primary ship-killing weapon. American doctrine also valued torpedoes, but American surface warfare planning placed greater emphasis on gun action, particularly after radar fire control made accurate gunnery possible in darkness and poor visibility. The naval battle of Guadalcanal demonstrated these doctrinal differences in the most brutal terms. When American and Japanese destroyers closed to ranges where visual identification became possible, the engagement devolved into a point-blank slugging match where rate of fire became the decisive factor. American destroyers could bring overwhelming volumes of fire onto Japanese vessels in the critical opening minutes of engagements. Japanese ships, despite the skill and courage of their crews, could not match American fire rates. The effect was cumulative. Even if individual Japanese shells were as destructive as American shells, and even if Japanese gun-laying was equally accurate, the simple arithmetic of shells per minute meant American destroyers hit their targets more frequently. The destroyer USS Laffey exemplified both the effectiveness and the limitations of American destroyer gunnery during the chaotic night action off Guadalcanal. Commanded by Lieutenant Commander William Hank, the Laffey engaged multiple Japanese vessels at ranges below 2,000 yards. Her 5-inch batteries fired over 400 rounds in approximately 20 minutes before Japanese shells disabled her engineering spaces and she went dead in the water. The survivors reported that Laffey's guns never stopped firing, even as Japanese shells tore through her superstructure. The sustained fire from her forward mounts was credited with damaging the Japanese battleship Hiei severely enough that air attacks the following day were able to sink her. The Laffey herself was lost, torpedoed, and sunk in the early morning hours, but her action demonstrated that American destroyers could inflict decisive damage on much larger vessels through sheer volume of accurate fire. Japanese after-action reports from the Guadalcanal engagement expressed surprise at American destroyer fire rates. Officers who survived described American 5-inch fire as resembling automatic weapon fire rather than deliberate naval gunnery. The Japanese destroyers Akatsuki and Udachi, both sunk during the engagement, were reportedly hit dozens of times by 5-inch shells that overwhelmed damage control efforts. Japanese damage control procedures were sophisticated and Japanese crews were well trained, but no damage control system could cope with shells arriving at intervals of 3 to 4 seconds for sustained periods. The technical analysis conducted by Japanese naval staff in the months following Guadalcanal identified the automatic breach mechanism as the critical American advantage. Japanese ordnance engineers studied captured American fire control manuals and technical diagrams that detailed the Mark 12 gun's operation. The sophistication of the American design impressed Japanese technical staff, but also revealed the scale of industrial capacity required to produce such weapons in quantity. The Mark 12 gun required precision machining, specialized alloys, and quality control standards that stretched Japanese industrial capabilities, even if Japanese designers could replicate the American design. Producing enough guns to rearm the destroyer fleet was beyond Japan's industrial capacity, while simultaneously maintaining production of aircraft, larger naval guns, and the thousands of other weapon systems required for the war effort. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The fire control systems that directed American destroyer gunfire multiplied the advantage that high rates of fire provided. Beginning in 1942, American destroyers received radar-directed fire control systems that allowed accurate gunnery in darkness, poor visibility, and against targets beyond visual range. The Mark 37 Director, combined with Mark 4 radar, could track targets and continuously compute firing solutions that accounted for target motion, ship motion, wind, and projectile ballistics. The system transmitted firing data electrically to the gun mounts, which adjusted automatically to the computed solution. Gun crews simply had to maintain their loading rhythm while the fire control system handled aiming. Japanese destroyers lacked equivalent radar fire control systems through most of the war. Japanese fire control relied on optical rangefinders and mechanical computers that required visual contact with the target. Japanese optical equipment was excellent, superior to American equivalents in some respects. Japanese rangefinders could track targets in low-light conditions where American optics struggled, but optical systems had fundamental limitations. They required direct line of sight to the target. They were affected by smoke, rain, and haze. Most critically, they could not provide accurate range data at night unless the target was illuminated by searchlights, which revealed the position of the illuminating ship to enemy vessels. The combination of high fire rates and radar fire control gave American destroyers overwhelming advantages in night actions. After mid-1942, American destroyers could detect Japanese vessels on radar at ranges exceeding 10 miles. They could track those vessels and compute firing solutions while remaining invisible to Japanese optical systems. When American destroyers opened fire, their shells often arrived as complete surprises to Japanese crews who had no warning they were under attack. By the time Japanese vessels identified the source of incoming fire and returned fire, American destroyers had already landed dozens of shells and could continue firing with accuracy the Japanese vessels, dependent on visual tracking of gun flashes, could not match. The Battle of Vela Gulf on the night of August 6 to 7, 1943, demonstrated the matured combination of American destroyer capabilities. 6 American destroyers under Commander Frederick Moosbrugger intercepted 4 Japanese destroyers attempting a resupply run down the slot to Kolombangara. Moosbrugger's force detected the Japanese ships on radar at 23,000 yards, well beyond visual range. The American destroyers closed to 10,000 yards, launched torpedoes, and then opened fire with their 5-inch batteries before the Japanese force even realized they were under attack. The engagement lasted 30 minutes. 3 of the 4 Japanese destroyers were sunk, including the Arashi, Hagikaze, and Kawakaze. The 4th destroyer, Shigure, escaped damaged. American destroyers suffered no losses and only minor damage from a single torpedo that passed close enough to USS Dunlap to cause whiplash damage from its wake. The one-sided nature of the victory was attributed directly to radar fire control combined with superior rates of fire. Japanese survivors recovered after the battle reported that American gunfire seemed to come from all directions simultaneously, and that the volume of fire made evasive maneuvers impossible. Ships attempting to turn away from one American destroyer would present their broadsides to another. Commander Moosbrugger's after-action report noted that his destroyers had expended over 4,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition in 30 minutes. The 6 ships averaged more than 2 shells per second for the entire engagement. This sustained fire was possible because ammunition hoists kept the guns supplied continuously and because the automatic breach mechanisms allowed gun crews to maintain maximum rates without exhaustion. Moosbrugger specifically credited the Mark 37 director and radar fire control system with allowing accurate fire in complete darkness against targets that were never visually acquired until after they were burning. Japanese naval doctrine attempted to compensate for destroyer gunnery disadvantages through tactical innovations. Japanese destroyers began operating in larger groups to concentrate their firepower and overwhelm individual American vessels. Japanese commanders emphasized torpedo attacks, using guns primarily to suppress American fire while closing to torpedo range. Some Japanese destroyers received primitive radar sets beginning in mid-1943. But these early warning radars could detect ships at useful ranges, but could not provide the accurate tracking data needed for fire control. The most significant Japanese tactical adaptation was increased emphasis on night optics and aggressive maneuvering. Japanese lookouts trained extensively in night vision techniques. Japanese destroyer captains learned to use darkness, weather, and terrain to close with American forces before being detected. When these tactics succeeded, Japanese destroyers could achieve devastating surprise attacks. The Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30th, 1942, demonstrated Japanese capabilities when tactical circumstances favored their approach. 8 Japanese destroyers ambushed 5 American cruisers, sinking 1 and damaging 3 others with torpedo attacks before withdrawing with only 1 destroyer damaged. But Tassafaronga represented the exception rather than the rule. As American radar coverage improved and American tactical doctrine evolved to exploit radar advantages, Japanese destroyers found fewer opportunities to leverage their optical superiority and torpedo capabilities. By mid-1943, American forces controlled enough of the Solomon Islands that Japanese resupply runs to isolated garrisons became increasingly hazardous. Japanese destroyers attempting these Tokyo Express runs faced American air attacks during daylight hours and American destroyer sweeps at night. The cumulative effect of repeated engagements where American destroyers held fire rate and fire control advantages began to tell on Japanese destroyer strength. Losses mounted faster than replacement construction could offset. The Japanese Navy had entered the war with approximately 170 destroyers. By the end of 1943, more than 60 had been sunk, and many others had sustained damage that reduced their combat effectiveness. American destroyer construction, by contrast, accelerated throughout the war. The Fletcher-class destroyers, mounting 5 5-inch 38 guns in modern enclosed mounts, entered service in large numbers beginning in mid-1942. By the end of 1943, the United States Navy had commissioned over 150 Fletcher-class destroyers alone, not counting other classes. The industrial capacity that produced American destroyers in such numbers also supported the complex maintenance and logistics systems that kept those ships operational. American destroyers operating in the South Pacific received regular ammunition replenishment from supply ships that brought shells forward from depots in the New Hebrides and New Caledonia. Those depots were supplied by convoys from Pearl Harbor and ultimately from ammunition production facilities on the American West Coast. The logistics chain functioned with sufficient reliability that American destroyer commanders rarely worried about ammunition conservation. They could fire thousands of rounds in a single engagement, knowing that resupply would arrive within days. Japanese destroyers faced progressively worsening logistics situations as American submarine operations devastated Japanese merchant shipping. Ammunition production in Japan struggled to meet demand from all services. Destroyer ammunition, while important, competed with requirements for battleships, cruisers, shore batteries, and anti-aircraft guns throughout the expanding defensive perimeter. Japanese destroyers, operating from Rabaul or Truk, could not count on regular ammunition resupply. Captains learned to ration their ammunition carefully, firing only when tactical circumstances demanded. This conservation necessity further reduced Japanese effective fire rates, since even when Japanese guns were capable of rapid fire, ammunition scarcity limited how long that fire could be sustained. The maintenance differential between American and Japanese destroyer forces became increasingly significant as the war progressed. American destroyers that sustained battle damage or mechanical failures could be withdrawn to rear area facilities for repair. The Navy established major repair facilities at Pearl Harbor, Espiritu Santo, and later at Ulithi Atoll. These facilities had machine shops, foundries, and specialized equipment capable of repairing or replacing virtually any destroyer component. Damaged ships could be restored to full operational status in weeks or months, depending on the severity of damage. Japanese repair facilities were limited and became progressively more constrained as the war turned against Japan. Major repair yards at Yokosuka, Kure, and Sasebo handled repairs for the entire fleet, but these facilities were increasingly vulnerable to American air attacks. Destroyers operating in the South Pacific that sustained damage often had to make the dangerous journey back to Japan for repairs, running a gauntlet of American submarines and aircraft. Many damaged ships were lost en route to repair facilities or were so badly damaged that they could not make the journey at all and had to be abandoned. The gun barrel wear issue illustrated the maintenance challenge in miniature. The 5-inch 38 gun fired a 54-pound projectile at high velocity using substantial powder charges. This combination created tremendous heat and pressure that gradually wore the barrel's rifling. After approximately 5,000 rounds, a gun barrel's accuracy degraded noticeably. After 8,000 to 10,000 rounds, barrels needed replacement. American destroyers that fired their guns extensively in combat could have worn barrels replaced during routine maintenance periods. The Navy maintained stocks of replacement barrels at forward bases and had procedures for changing barrels at sea if necessary. Japanese Type 3 gun barrels experienced similar wear patterns, but replacement barrels were scarce. A Japanese destroyer that fired heavily in combat might continue operating with worn barrels because replacement barrels were not available or because the ship could not be withdrawn from operations long enough to perform the replacement. Worn barrels reduced accuracy and increased the likelihood of mechanical failures. Japanese gun crews working with worn equipment faced additional challenges beyond those inherent in their manual loading systems. The cumulative effect of these material and industrial factors appeared in the casualty statistics for destroyer actions throughout the Pacific War. From Guadalcanal in late 1942 through the Philippine Sea in mid-1944, American destroyers consistently achieved favorable exchange ratios in surface actions. When American and Japanese destroyers met in surface engagements, American vessels more often survived the encounter. The differential was not absolute. Japanese destroyers sank numerous American ships and Japanese destroyer crews fought with skill and determination. But the statistical pattern was clear. Destroyer actions in the Philippines campaign of late 1944 demonstrated the matured American system against an increasingly desperate Japanese defense. During the Battle of Surigao Strait on October 25, 1944, American destroyers executed torpedo attacks against Japanese battleships and cruisers attempting to transit the strait. After launching torpedoes, the American destroyers withdrew under cover of smoke, while maintaining continuous 5-inch fire against pursuing Japanese destroyers. The American destroyer, USS Melvin, fired over 700 rounds in a running engagement that lasted approximately 90 minutes. Her gun crews maintained rates exceeding 12 rounds per minute per gun, even while maneuvering violently to avoid Japanese return fire. The Japanese destroyers Asagumo and Yamagumo, both damaged by torpedoes earlier in the action, attempted to close with American destroyers for gun action. Both Japanese vessels were overwhelmed by concentrated American 5-inch fire that arrived faster than their damage control parties could manage flooding and casualties. The Asagumo sank after taking dozens of hits. The Yamagumo was so badly damaged that she was scuttled by her own crew after they abandoned ship. American destroyers involved in these actions reported no difficulty maintaining ammunition supply and noted that their automatic loading systems functioned reliably despite hours of continuous operation. Commander Amos T. Hathaway, commanding Destroyer Squadron 54 during the Surigao Strait action, wrote in his after-action report that the rate of fire advantage enjoyed by American destroyers had become so significant that surface gun actions against Japanese destroyers were essentially decided before they began. Hathaway noted that his squadron's destroyers could collectively place more than 600 shells on target in the first minute of an engagement. No destroyer, regardless of armor or damage control capabilities, could survive such concentrated fire for more than a few minutes. Japanese destroyers attempting to close for torpedo attacks or gun actions had to survive this withering fire while crossing the engagement range, and few succeeded. The psychological impact of facing sustained rapid fire affected Japanese destroyer crews in ways that after-action reports and survivor accounts revealed. Japanese sailors who survived destroyer actions consistently described American gunfire as overwhelming and inescapable. The continuous arrival of shells at intervals measured in seconds created stress that degraded crew performance, even before physical damage to the ship impaired operations. Japanese damage control parties attempting to fight fires and control flooding found their work disrupted by the constant arrival of additional shells. Gun crews attempting to return fire found their efforts complicated by the need to take cover from incoming rounds. Lieutenant Tamichi Hara, commanding the Japanese destroyer Shigure, survived multiple engagements with American forces and wrote extensively about his experiences after the war. Hara described American destroyer gunfire as psychologically devastating, even when it was not immediately destructive. The knowledge that American destroyers could maintain sustained fire for extended periods meant that any engagement would inevitably favor the Americans unless Japanese forces could achieve decisive hits quickly. Hara noted that Japanese destroyer tactics evolved toward extreme aggression in the opening moments of engagements because commanders understood they had to win quickly or not at all. This tactical evolution toward desperation attacks reflected the broader strategic situation Japan faced by late 1944. The combined fleet had been decisively defeated at Philippine Sea in June. American forces had returned to the Philippines in October. The defensive perimeter that Japan had established in early 1942 was collapsing under sustained American offensives. Japanese destroyers, once employed for offensive operations and fleet actions, were increasingly relegated to escort duties and resupply missions to isolated garrisons. These missions exposed them to American air attacks and submarine operations that decimated Japanese destroyer strength. The Battle off Samar on October the 25th, 1944, the same day as Surigao Strait, illustrated Japanese destroyer capabilities and limitations in the desperate circumstances of late-war operations. Japanese destroyers screening Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force engaged American escort carriers and their destroyer escorts in a chaotic action off the Philippine island of Samar. The Japanese destroyers fought aggressively, closing to torpedo range despite heavy American air attacks. Several Japanese destroyers were sunk, but they succeeded in damaging multiple American ships and demonstrated that Japanese destroyer crews retained their fighting spirit even as material circumstances turned decisively against them. But Samar also revealed that fighting spirit alone could not overcome material disadvantages. American destroyer escorts, smaller vessels with less firepower than fleet destroyers, nevertheless mounted the same 5-inch 38 guns as larger ships. These destroyer escorts engaged Japanese destroyers at close range and achieved hit rates that reflected the same fire rate advantages that characterized fleet destroyer actions. The destroyer escort, USS Samuel B. Roberts, sunk during the action, fired over 600 rounds from her two 5-inch guns before Japanese cruiser fire disabled her. The Roberts gun crews maintained maximum rates of fire throughout the engagement, despite knowing they faced overwhelming odds. By early 1945, Japanese destroyer strength had been reduced to a fraction of pre-war levels. The surviving destroyers faced fuel shortages that limited operations even when tactical situations demanded action. Japanese petroleum production and tanker shipping had been devastated by American submarine operations. Destroyers that might have sortied to contest American operations remained in port because fuel was not available. This immobility rendered Japanese destroyers irrelevant to the final campaigns of the war, even when they remained physically intact. The American destroyer force, by contrast, reached its peak strength in early 1945, with hundreds of modern destroyers available for operations across the Pacific. These ships supported the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, screened carrier task forces operating off the Japanese home islands, and conducted shore bombardment missions against targets throughout the Western Pacific. The operational tempo that American destroyers maintained would have been impossible without the reliable mechanical systems that allowed sustained high rates of fire and the logistics networks that kept ammunition flowing to forward units. The shore bombardment missions that American destroyers conducted during the final months of the war demonstrated capabilities that extended beyond surface warfare. 5-inch 38 guns could engage shore targets with accuracy that made destroyers valuable for fire support missions. At Okinawa, destroyers on radar picket duty not only defended against kamikaze attacks, but also provided naval gunfire support to Marine and Army units ashore. The same automatic loading systems that enabled rapid fire against surface targets allowed sustained bombardment of shore positions. Destroyers could fire hundreds of rounds against specific targets, displacing to avoid counter-battery fire and returning to resume bombardment without degradation in fire rate or accuracy. Japanese shore batteries attempting to engage American destroyers during these bombardment missions faced the same rate of fire disadvantage that Japanese destroyers had encountered in surface actions. American destroyers could land 10 to 15 shells on a Japanese shore battery in the time required for the Japanese battery to fire 2 or 3 rounds in return. The cumulative effect suppressed Japanese coastal defenses and allowed American amphibious operations to proceed with reduced casualties from shore fire. The proximity fuse, introduced for naval use in early 1943, multiplied the effectiveness of American destroyer anti-aircraft fire in the same way that high rates of fire multiplied effectiveness against surface targets. The proximity fuse used a miniature radio transmitter that detected when the shell approached an aircraft and detonated automatically at optimal range. This eliminated the need for time delay fuses that required precise calculation of target range and speed. 5-inch shells with proximity fuses could engage aircraft successfully, even when range estimates were imperfect, dramatically increasing the probability of hits against maneuvering targets. Japanese aircraft attacking American destroyer formations in 1944 and 45 encountered anti-aircraft fire that combined high rates of fire with proximity fuse shells. The result was defensive firepower that made successful attacks extremely difficult. Kamikaze pilots attempting to crash their aircraft into American destroyers had to penetrate anti-aircraft fire that could place dozens of shells near their aircraft in seconds. Many kamikazes were destroyed before reaching their targets. Those that survived to impact had often sustained damage from near misses that degraded their ability to aim accurately or maintain controlled flight. The destroyer USS Laffey, commissioned in 1944 to replace the vessel of the same name, lost at Guadalcanal, survived attacks by 22 kamikaze aircraft off Okinawa on April 16, 1945. The ship's 5-inch batteries fired over 3,000 rounds during the action, shooting down multiple attacking aircraft and driving others off course. The Laffey sustained 6 direct hits from kamikazes and 4 bomb hits, but remained afloat and was eventually repaired. Her survival was attributed to the volume of anti-aircraft fire her guns could produce and to the damage control capabilities that American destroyers possessed. The final destroyer actions of the Pacific War occurred during July and early August 1945, as American surface forces conducted shore bombardment missions against targets in the Japanese home islands. These operations demonstrated complete American naval dominance. Destroyers operated in Japanese coastal waters without significant opposition, their 5-inch batteries systematically destroying shore installations, small craft, and transportation infrastructure. Japanese forces lacked the fuel, ammunition, and operational capability to contest these bombardments effectively. When the war ended on August 15, 1945, the United States Navy possessed over 370 destroyers, with more under construction. The Japanese Navy retained fewer than 40 operational destroyers, most of which were immobilized by fuel shortages or in need of repairs that could not be completed with available resources. The disparity reflected not just combat losses, but the accumulated effect of industrial capacity differences that had grown progressively wider as the war continued. The rate of fire advantage that American destroyers enjoyed throughout the Pacific War was not a single technical innovation, but the product of systematic design choices made years before the war began. American naval architects who designed the 5-inch 38 guns understood that future warfare would require rapid fire against surface targets and aircraft. They created a weapon system that automated functions which other nations expected crews to perform manually. American industrial capacity then produced these sophisticated weapons in quantities that Japanese industry could not match. The training systems that prepared American destroyer crews multiplied the effect of technical advantages. Crews drilled until loading procedures became automatic. Fire control teams practiced until they could maintain accurate fire while maneuvering violently. The institutional knowledge developed through this training meant that replacement crews arriving on ships after casualties could maintain the same high-performance standards as original crews. The logistics networks that sustained American destroyer operations ensured that technical and training advantages translated into operational effectiveness. Ammunition arrived regularly. Replacement barrels were available when guns wore out. Damaged ships could be repaired and returned to service. These unglamorous support functions made the difference between theoretical capability and sustained combat effectiveness. Japanese destroyer crews fought with courage and skill throughout the war. Individual Japanese sailors and officers demonstrated tactical competence and personal bravery in countless actions. But courage and skill could not overcome the systematic advantages that American destroyers enjoyed. When Japanese destroyers engaged American vessels, they faced opponents who could fire 3 times as many shells per minute, who could aim accurately in conditions where Japanese optical fire control was ineffective, and who operated with logistical support that Japanese forces could not match. The lessons of destroyer warfare in the Pacific extended beyond the specific technical details of gun mechanisms and fire control systems. The American advantage demonstrated that modern warfare rewarded systematic institutional development more than individual excellence. The United States Navy had invested decades in developing doctrine, training programs, and logistics systems that allowed sophisticated weapons to be used effectively. Japan had built individual weapons that were often as good or better than American equivalents, but lacked the institutional depth to employ those weapons with sustained effectiveness. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.